Welcome, everyone, to our series of interviews that we're doing before Wisdomcon. Our conference is September 24th to the 26th. We are so excited to have you join us here today. Today, I have a very special guest with me, Dan Winter, who will be speaking to us about actually a lot of different topics in regards to his research and his incredible work that I am very honored to share on our platform. Now, a little bit about Dan before we begin. Dan Winter's background is as multifaceted as his viewpoint. Graduated with honors from the University of Detroit, Dan pursued graduate studies in psychology and the origin of languages. In addition to his academic background, he has worked as a systems analyst with IBM, an industrial metallurgist and crystallographer. He has undertaken many diverse studies from the quantum physics to modeling at the MIT Space Lab to developing an early biofeedback prototype equipment as Dr. Albert Axe's protege. Widely traveled, Dan has sojourned to study at the Gurdjieff School of Sacred Gymnastics in Florence with Buckminster Fuller, the Giza Pyramids in Israel, and the Andes at Findhorn. Dan, so please tell us about your work.
Well, thank you. You have the kind of baraka that makes these conversations fun. And it's true, your interest in terms of your psychic abilities and where that went is related to how I got into this, because I was studying, as you said, graduate psychophysiology at University of Detroit after doing an electrical engineering curriculum. And I was actually, I was the polygraph operator and building the circuits for polygraph for measuring. We were the first lab in the world to differentiate fear and anger in pure electrical terms. So we built the electrical engineering of differentiating emotions electrically. And as I got deeper and deeper into that, I began to realize there is basically a process you would call bliss, or a bliss process. And that relates to what happened to me at the Gurdjieff School, which was claymont.org, George Washington's nephew's pig farm in West Virginia, and began to have my first intense Kundalini experiences. At the time I still am double Scorpio. I was a virgin and had a lot of chi and nervous energy, I suppose, high metabolism. And anyway, so that led me to world travels where I inquired deeply. I followed Brother Philip to the Andes, studying the Moxine light, the secrets of the Andes. And I lived at Findhorn. And I worked with Bucky Fuller in Florence and had a lot of experience. And then I've been teaching physics of consciousness for over 30 years, I have to say. And we've developed all these biofeedback applications, which, for example, flameandmind.com, where we really believe we're measuring the frequency signature in brainwaves of real bliss process, and believe we understand not only how to measure bliss and peak perception and what it is, but that makes it more teachable.
Amazing. And so in this journey, you really were able to go down to the really, the fundamental aspects of the physics of this, a really, really wonderful, profound understanding. You are going to be discussing a little bit about wisdom and how we see that. Can you talk a little bit about your presentation? What are you going to be talking about?
Yeah, I actually am pretty excited about the concept of wisdom. We spend a lot of time traveling in Australia. In fact, I have a base there and we've taught there for 20 years, and many friends taught in almost every major city there. Of course, a lot of experience with indigenous peoples, the Aboriginals. And the Aboriginals, of course, are very clear what wisdom is. Wisdom, in short, is access to ancestor memory. If you don't have ancestor memory, ancestor voices, songline, dreaming track, you don't have wisdom. And if you kind of look even deeper into that, it kind of means access to the long wave. And that's a very resonant idea from even Surfers of the Shibuya by Uncle Joe in Jose Argüelles' work, which was about riding the long wave and what it means. So ancestor memory is related to access to long wave, and that physics is central to my life's work, actually, and the nature of bliss. And we call that process fusion in the blood. And that's the article, fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood. And essentially, and here's the short summary of that science, if I may, when I was at Heart Math Institute and finally convinced them the meaning of what heart coherence is, and they kind of didn't get it right. But we have, if you read that story, realheartcoherence.com, and I'm credited in the literature for inventing the term heart coherence because I invented its measurement. Point being that then I pioneered what Glenn Rhine then did, which was measure the effect of, at that point, it was coherent EKG, heart coherence, measure that effect of that on the braiding or imploding, literally, of DNA. So imagine the threads, the strands of your DNA, and you have these threads, like a double thread. But then if you braid the thread, you get string. And if you braid the string, you get rope. And if you braid the rope, you get fat rope. The braid of the braid, the braid on the braid, 7 times is literally what's happening in your DNA, and the plot thickens. I mean, the DNA thickens. And what happens, that I call fusion of blood. And we proved by measurement, thanks to Glenn Rhine at my suggestion, that when you have this feeling of love correlated to measuring coherence in your heart, and now realheartcoherence.com, that second order power spectral spectrum, which I invented to measure heart coherence, it is a functional lie detector. It works functionally. If he says, will you marry me? And if he's not telling the truth, his heart coherence will go down and not up. It is a functional lie detector because your heart cannot become a laser unless the wave is shareable. In fact, it defines what heart coherence and what laser coherence is the shareablewave.com. That's Shelley's site. Anyway, point being that the recursive braiding in DNA imploding when you feel love, which is literally embeddability, and we call it the embeddability monitor, and sometimes I do talk fast, oh well. And we have measured and proved that heart coherence, the song in your heart when you feel passion, implodes. It's a phonon cascade, looks like a caduceus, causes your DNA to braid, implode, and embed the long wave. Now, we have a lot more to say about how that becomes wisdom, but here's a clue. Later, when we measured the ringing in the ears that the Aboriginals called the song of the ancestors, we measured the ringing in the ears heard by Kundalini experiencers. I did that with Bentov. I was there in his lab when we invented the physics of Kundalini, the capacitive accelerometrics. And when we measured the harmonics that people hear in their ears, that ringing, Valerie's here, she might not mind me mentioning that when Valerie hears her ears ringing, she tells which ear's ringing to know which ancestor is making a phone call. This is called Sangreal, the song in the blood. And the physics is that the rotating magnetic donut of human bliss energizes the liquids. It's measurable in the ventricle horns, which the liquid becomes more crystalline. It's called getting horny. I think we know what that means. And it is sexual juice conserved. It really is. And that phonon ringing in the ears, we measured it. It fits the frequency cascade, which we use to produce bliss. We have the world's most powerful binaural bliss for inducing bliss. And I ask you, why is that ancestor memory? I have an answer to you. Why would that be ancestor memory, that ringing? It's the ringing of the blood. What's the mechanism of ancestor memory? Because if ever there's anything called wisdom in Aboriginal, that's it.
Can you, for listeners that are just tuning into this work and the work that you do, can you clarify, what do you mean by long wave? Describe that.
Essentially, what we're saying is the longer the wave that's coherent, literally, the bigger the memory. It's not even complicated. And it just happens that ancestors ride on long waves. And we actually think we have an answer to the question of why. Because when that coherent cascade, that ringing, that implosion, which feels like lightning in the case of Kundalini. And this is all at the work I did with Bentov is in the biomechanics of Kundalini, goldenmean.info/Kundalini, including the last 4 professional films we made on the physics of Kundalini. So it's a pretty in-depth study there. We know the HRV harmonics, we know the brainwave harmonics, we know the breath harmonics, we know the sacrocranial harmonics. We know the physics. In fact, we know how to measure Kundalini in the microwave, adenosine diphosphate, 1.91 angstroms. It's called microwave emission scanning. This is a detailed model of the physics of Bliss. But what we meant by when the short wave embeds well in the long wave, that perfect embedding obviously is idealized by golden ratio called phase conjugation. And that looks like the caduceus of Hermes for a good reason. Mm-hmm. It's pine cones kissing noses kind of thing. We talk about it all the time.
Yeah.
So when the short wave embeds well in the longer wave, that is literally the physics of access to ancestor memory. Now, there's a much more detailed electrical engineer's version of this story, and I don't know how much your listeners would like at this moment, but when that long wave cascade, the way we predicted the frequencies of the brain waves, the frequencies of the sound, the frequencies of the sacrocranial, even the frequencies of the adenosine diphosphate and microwave, all of those frequencies fit one equation, golden ratio exponents of Planck, which is called phase conjugate origins of negentropy, the title of my book at fractalfield.com. So what's happening is when that cascade, it's like a squirt gun that squirts down to a particular threshold called the Planck length, the musical key signature of the universe. And what squirts out there is what's called a longitudinal wave, sometimes called scalar or compressional or torsional. And that wave goes farther and faster, but it can only send in and withdraw information at the fractal nodes of that array called sacred space, because it's the only place the vortex line up precisely enough to phase conjugate, which in phase conjugate optics is called four-wave mixing. So ancestor memory requires access to that grid. We know how to measure it in sacred space. It's dodecaecosa, and the nodes of the Earth grid like that affect radioactive critical mass. It's a powerful understanding of the physics of sacred space and fits beautifully the ancestral notions, the Aboriginal notions of song lines, dreaming track, and all that kind of stuff. So have I said too much?
Not at all.
And now suppose you wanted to be an electrical engineer that could make that electric field do that. You would add another layer of detail. And that's kind of what I think we've done, actually. For example, we have built an electric field called Therify.net in wide use in 25 countries for rejuvenation, which has just recently begun to be used by lucid dreaming schools because we produce lucid dreams. But we know what the physics is, actually. The physics is that when we do that phase conjugate broad spectrally from noble gas optical conjugation down to radio frequencies conjugation to the infrasound conjugation, all in the noble gas, Therify.net. It's a plasma system. And 30% of the people report some sharpening of vision in that plasma, and 30% often report some form of bliss, actually, and dramatic reports of lucid dreaming and time reversal rejuvenation. There are lots of names for that, but the technical term would be phase conjugate negentropy. So there's an example. When you said the Akash is a kind of layer in that starts with DNA radio, we say, well, we know a lot more about that physics that makes that something you can actually build as an electric field. For example, at the center of every ladder rung in DNA and water hydrogen bond, you have hydrogen, which I have written a new equation that proves the radii of hydrogen are profoundly fractal, golden ratio exponents of Planck. So we know how water functions in DNA radio by phase conjugate, embedding this longitudinal array. But see, a longitudinal wave won't distribute its inertia unless it meets another compression point called sacred space. That means, for example, that when we do remote healing, which Therify.net is famous for, it works better if sender and receiver are at a magnetic line cross. It works better at sunrise and sunset, like Agnihotra. But we don't teach that as a mystery. We teach that as physics. Einstein called action at a distance spooky because he didn't understand how longitudinal interferometry works. But when you do that ancestor memory radio, that big field you call the Akashic Records, exactly what the Aboriginals were talking about becomes a physics that we understand you need a compressional node point to exchange that inertia from the compressional to the transverse wave, which gives us access to the information that's been squeezed in. Very practical example. Successful death is measurably an electrical black hole. Mm-hmm. Memory goes through death because if compression is successful, that's why the sequence of 4 visions you see at death lattice carbon tunnel spiral is actually DNA imploding. And that's why death visions are contagious, as surgeons attest. Because to get into that array of ancestral memory, which is a longitudinal array, requires compression. That's why you can see the ghost leaving the body beautifully if you die in a stone circle in sacred forest. Whereas if you died in an electrosmog poison hospital full of metal and crap, no, that's scrambling the propagation of that longitudinal wave. So it teaches, once you know the definition of sacred space electrically, you can design where birth and death are possible, which is how you get into and out of your Akashic records.
So, but can the person create that black hole opening just by their vibrational frequency, regardless of where they are?
Well, sometimes you walk on water, sometimes you take a bridge. so no, I mean, when the ETs checked in, and we realized that Uru Asa LM Jerusalem means Uru, dragon, Asa, queen of El, place of the phase shift, or Stargate. So Jerusalem was a Stargate. That's why there was a war in the first place. But guess what? The Stargate's broken, so now we need to cancel the war. But the point is, the ETs have recently told us that when they set up their Stargate mechanisms, they do it on Earth where there are already natural magnetic line crosses because the compression has begun. So yes, I mean, if you need to have a bliss experience and you happen to be in a metal building full of electrosmog in an ugly city, well, okay, try it, fine. But if you want to accomplish this regularly, you don't want to unpack your aura that big if you're not in a fractal. So that's biologic architecture, and we have whole curriculum in that.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating and so important to understand that. But the majority of us, unfortunately, we're living in this society in which we're in these little boxes, And I also see that the boxes or the shape of the room also does interfere with the expansion of our multidimensional body as well. But
yes. Well, just to say briefly, that's science. The science of what that is, if anyone would like the detail, is that organic materials have what's called high dielectric constant. It relates to what Reich called orgone. High dielectric constant means capacitance can breathe through it. So a seed will die in an aluminum box, and so will the soul of your child in an aluminum school for the same reason, because the capacitance can't unpack. Whereas if you have natural wood and natural fabric and natural stone, then the capacitance can breathe and your soul can breathe. And that's why all in ancient sacred structures, they never had heavy metal in them because the capacitance couldn't breathe. So that's the introduction to how sacred space is built in biologic architecture.
And also the clothes that we wear, the kind of quality of clothing that we're wearing, and jewelry and all of these metals, that interfere with the body. Now, are there certain things that can magnify that are you said the natural? So are there certain things specifically that we can utilize that assist our magnifying of that?
I think it's goldenmean.info/fractal clothing. We have a fractal clothing project well underway, actually. And it all boils down to what in electrical engineering is called dielectric constant, which means capacitance can breathe, charge can pack and unpack, breathe efficiently. And an example would be that if you have hemp, especially unbleached hemp, clothing has a very high dielectric constant, which is also fabulous stuff, and it's also a little expensive. But indeed, your aura can unpack, and that's measurable with the GDV. I mean, you can measure the effect on the aura. Another practical example is when they first proved that negative ion wind can heal just about anything if it's powerful enough. And in fact, now Therify.net as plasma is just negative ion wind on steroids. It's super powerful negative ion wind. That's what it is. That's what the plasma is. And in both cases, negative ion wind healing people in hospitals and Therify.net plasma, it'll work great in a room of natural material and fresh air. But you get a room of all synthetic material and steel and aluminum, it doesn't work at all. And the same physics applies. It's because the capacitance can't breathe, and so the charge field can't build up. And like the plasma from Therify, just like the elementals, it wants to be loved, and you treat it like your pet puppy dog. And eventually it decides who it wants to heal and who it doesn't. And you don't have a lot of control over it because it's eventually self-aware. That's living plasma, just like angels and elementals. Now, if you were watching an Aboriginal talk to his ancestors, you'd think they were like sitting there asleep but awake, and you see them mumbling a little bit, and they're moving very slowly like this. And their attention is gone down the song line, and they're communicating with the ancestral memory, and often choosing whether to make it rain in the process. So they're riding the long wave. Well, what we're saying is that ultimately DNA has been making a library of survival information. You call it a hologram, I call it longitudinal interferometry, same thing, for billions of years. And to get into or out of that library, which is where you have to go when you die, so don't try to take anger through the compression experience called death, because it doesn't squeeze well.
Right. Yes.
So, but to get into that array, it's just an array of pure principle survival information. Every time you had a eureka or an aha experience and your hair stood up by imploding capacitance, you gathered pure principle for that library. So getting into and out of that library is the process of communing with ancestral memory. That is the big field in which DNA has been building for 1 billion years. And why is that important? Well, if you were to ask an Aboriginal, they would say, nothing else is important, actually. And if you see, in a more immediate way to think about that is, that ability to lucid dream is probably the best way to find out who's going to take memory through death. So whatever enabled you lucid dream tells you what you're going to take through death. And is that important? Probably. Like the immortality machine.
Right.
And we know now what electric field makes lucid dreaming. It's implosive compression that causes a propagation in a longitudinal array, literally the raising of the JED, the physics of Bliss. And why is that important? Well, again, probably in terms of immortality effect, nothing else is. And by the way, later when we study the physics of Stargates, it's basically a lucid dream in high density, as Jodie Foster knew.
So what's the opposite of that? So let's say we don't do this throughout our lives. We don't tap into that, right? So what would be the opposite?
Doing Groundhog Day?
Exactly.
Well, Seth in Education of Oversoul 7 was talking about this. He says, well, if you listen to the instructions of your soul, then you come to the attention of the oversoul and you get a lot of communication with the oversoul. But if you ignore the instructions of your soul and don't do your life purpose, basically then your oversoul doesn't talk to you, and then you just keep coming back again and again until you start listening.
Exactly.
And so another way to think about that, which I often talk about, which is think about the yearning at the moment of death of your most significant ancestors, and you will get some idea of the wind and the sails of the soul group memory of your family. Because that yearning, I give you my sister, when she grew up, she always was yearning to do Broadway show tunes. Guess what her young daughter ended up doing for half of her life? Literally moving to Broadway and trying, and she got there really. But it's an example of how the yearning of the ancestors is directly the wind and the sails of the kids. And amazing. GDV is a way to measure that. GDV.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Dan, thank you so much. What an awesome connection with you in conversation. I really appreciate it. And so we are so excited to have you at Wisdomcon. Is there anything else you want to share about what you will be presenting at the conference?
Well, I'm happy to be with you. I am so glad you bring this kind of people together for this very important conversation. People can reach me at info@fractalfield.com, index at fractalfield.com, the one about ensoulment, fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood, and the measurement of bliss, flameinmind.com. So we have lots of resources out there. Happy to share. I'm delighted to chat with you anytime, Geraldine. Thank you.
Beautiful. Please do reach out to Dan and his amazing work. You can see all of the links for his work down below. And we will see you at Wisdomcon, September 24th to the 26th. Please do register at the website and share and like this if you found some value in this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you soon.
Bye, Geraldine.